When I was still in high school, I started working at a restaurant and I started out in the dish pit at this restaurant. And I remember I was trying to understand, okay, I'm not just here doing dishes, I'm doing dishes well, so that there's a spot on dish or a spot on a spoon. This is a nice restaurant. That really lowers the value of the experience, that damages the server's ability to collect tips, overall lessens the reputation of the restaurant. So if I mess up just one piece of silverware here, that does actually a decent amount of damage to the business, so I need to be doing this well. But I was surprised by the fact that a lot of the other kids who were my age who were working for a restaurant at the time, that was not the case. And because of that, I went from being somebody who was working part-time and kind of asking for more hours to be working pretty dang near to full-time at this place because they had just let everybody else go when I was getting all the shifts. And so it was one of those things where I may not have reaped returns immediately, but I did eventually reap some rewards that came from that because they recognized me as somebody who they could trust and who shared the vision that they were trying to bring to the customer experience in the first place.
Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And we are back with the third in our 5-part series that we've been doing here on our adult framework that we use here in Unbound. But it's not just for education. It's also, we think, just useful for everyday life and ultimately is, I think, useful in a variety of situations, no matter what age or life demographic that you're in. And so today we are talking about understanding. And so we hope that this conversation, we figured that we would get Trent in on it with us as well, because he has some really interesting insights from a lot of his passions and understanding history and cultural and historical context that we thought would be valuable contributions here. And Jonathan, I think it's pretty safe to say that they were. This was really helpful to kind of flesh this conversation out, I think.
Well, it's always fun to have Trent in the studio, and it was fun talking to him. Plus, he brought a little color variety. If you're watching this on YouTube, David and I inadvertently showed up with the same shade of shirt. Trent does not, so it gave you a little bit of color relief if you have to watch this instead of listening to it on the radio. But yeah, Trent has both great perspective. He also has a pretty interesting personal story that you want to stick around to the end for, where maybe in a surprising way, this whole idea of ask, understand, and do comes to a crisis point, a point where the action has to be fast and it has to be based on what was asked and understood beforehand. So stick around for that. Well, welcome back to the podcast, Trent. We're all sort of laughing here because, as we have said before, Trent is our professional speaker, so we're really looking forward to all the insight and wisdom he's bringing us. He's just proven recently he's not a professional IT guy like David, as we had just a slight little detail with a Ethernet cord that was only plugged in on one end. But we have that fixed now. And now that we understand how Ethernet cords work, and we've actually taken the action and done the things we need to do to make it work, after we asked the question, why is Trent so pixelated? We're now on the third part of our adult learning framework, which is ask, do, and understand. And so with that, David, would you like to explain what understand is besides Ethernet cords and pixelation?
Wow, that was incredible, Jonathan. I don't have words to express just the.
Don't go into what you're trying to express, David. We'll just leave it right there.
Yeah, we should just leave that intro to stand as it is. But yeah, 10 out of 10, no notes. So, as far as understand, first of all, if you're coming to this episode and you have not listened to the first two in this series about our adult framework, you should definitely do so. It might give you a little bit more context for what we talk about in this episode. And that's really helpful because this episode we actually are going to be talking a lot about context. Because really, as Jonathan mentioned in the previous episode, the model should actually go ask, understand, do, but adult doesn't really work as a very catchy acronym, so we decided to just flip the two. So really, the main things that you need to know are that we believe that the world now works in a questions-based paradigm, not an answers-based paradigm, so it's important to be able to ask good questions, not necessarily to be able to have all of the answers immediately in your head. And so then it's important to be able to act off of that information, but a very crucial part in between those two steps is to be able to understand the context in which you're actually asking the question. Because once you actually find an answer to the questions that you're asking, whether it's trying to figure out some sort of problem for work or try to make a decision on what direction that you should go in life or relationships or whatever other thing that you might be trying to figure out is, it's important once you find an initial answer to some of the initial questions that you might be asking to actually understand the full context of what that answer really means and to just have a full grasp of that. So that's a very quick 10,000 foot overview of understand and what we're going to be diving into in more detail here.
And maybe we can exhibit this best by looking at things that we call the big questions. So one of our premises here is that everybody asks and answers the big questions. It's just that people don't always do it consciously. So subconsciously you do that. In other words, you make decisions on actions on what you think about great big things like what happens when you die, what is the purpose of life, what are you here for, those kinds of things. But there's a big difference between people who sort of like, I feel like I should maximize pleasure and minimize pain, and that's probably the reason it's here, and I'm not sure if there's really a bigger purpose of that. Whatever else is going on, there's a default then set into their decision making. Versus somebody who's really thought deeply about these questions, has decided that they have attached themselves, in our case, to a Christian worldview. We understand what the purpose of life is, what happens to us when we die, and why we're here and why we're born in the first place. That has a saturating impact on throughout all your life and all the decision-making things you make. And so understanding that is almost another level. So you might say, yes, this is what I put my faith in. Then there's another level when you understand what you're putting your faith in that continues on from that. Trent is a particular student of history. And Trent, I know you've been reading some interesting biographies recently. There's a level of sort of understanding. I know what capitalism is. I know what socialism is. There's a different level of understanding when you've read a lot of deep biographies about Churchill and Stalin. You see the contrast there in a way that, it reinforces what you sort of know about what socialism is and what capitalism is, but it gives a lot of depth and understanding to that really changes the actions that are available to you. I don't know, Trent, if you want to pick up and talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, kind of like building a puzzle, but having a framework of what you're trying to build, right? So if you take out a jigsaw puzzle and you build the border first like you're supposed to, it's a heck of a lot easier to then figure out that new puzzle piece where it's actually supposed to go in the picture. You have something that you're approximating it off of instead of just throwing it into this blank space that is not connected to anything else. So that extra bit of framework that you've built around it gives you that extra level of comprehension where you can then understand what you're actually trying to build out here. And like you're saying, that's true with something like history. You can't really understand politics or present movements without understanding political history or economic history. And same thing for just day-to-day activities that you get involved in. If you understand your own history and your own different ways of doing things, your own skill sets, your own deficiencies, and you can get a better account of what those actually look like when you are dealing with real-world situations, you're going to be better equipped than master the next thing that comes up, the next struggle that you have to deal with, just because you have a better understanding of yourself. And of course, we can also say that Christian worldview helps with all of those things because it connects to both yourself, to politics, all the way back to just, business and pretty much anything else that you can think of.
Let's see if we can put some practical flesh on these bones and give you an example to not just illustrate this understand piece, but really to set the whole thing up. And this is where we talk about this being an educational framework. We've used this quote a lot. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. This is a useful model in the sense that this is not the only way to understand these things. This may not even be the best way to understand these things, but it gives a quick framework, a puzzle border, to use Trent's example here, that allows you to sort of put context in things and to have a quick practical use as well. So let's say a young person is going to get a job, and they get a job because they want to buy things, and parents say, well, we're doing these things. If you want to buy something extra, that's on you. Or perhaps you need to pay for college or you need to pay for whatever, and so you have time to earn a job. And so a young person says, well, here's the thing that's going on. I need to buy something. My bank account is close to zero, and so therefore I need to go get a job. So they go and fill out an application at the local convenience store. But in our case, let's use something real. We have a really fantastic market close to us called Valley Pike. And it's a coffee shop and a deli and some other things. And it's a place that a lot of us like to hang out. And so let's say we know lots of students, our own students, my own children have worked there. And so we have some real familiarity with how the place works. And so let's say that somebody decides to go down there and get a job. So they fill out an application and they're hired to work at Valley Pike. And they say, okay, what's the hours? They say, well, you show up at 8 o'clock and you're going to work till 2 or whatever. That's the first shift. And so somebody says, okay, well, I need to get here at 7:30. That's a requirement. I'm going to work and do what you tell me to until 2, and then I'm going to leave. That's my end of the bargain. I show up for those hours. And your end of the bargain is you give me a paycheck at the hours that the money you said you're going to pay me hourly. Now, is that true or is that not? That's absolutely 100% true. That's exactly how it works. And that's how the vast majority of people who work at Valley Pike treat the entire situation. Now, let's take that same thing and transform it a little bit by moving it into this theoretical kind of framework that we're talking about. The first thing would be to do is to ask, what is it that Valley Pike is trying to do? And what is it that delivers value to the customers at Valley Pike? Well, there's a coffee shop at Valley Pike. And so clearly one of those things is that, somebody comes in, buys coffee. They pay, they think is a normal price for coffee, and they get coffee. But there's something else to it. Valley Pike's in a converted barn. It's a place where people go because it's a nice aesthetic place. They like to sit in it. They like to be in that location. A lot of people here locally go because they think they'll meet other people that they know. And so there's a community crossroads aspect to it. The staff is friendly. The place is a good place to hang out. It's a place where you can order your cup of coffee and sort of sit down and relax, maybe unwind a little bit after work, or maybe catch your breath before you go to work in the morning. So asking those questions, what is Valley Pike here for, and what is it doing, and what is the reason they do these things, that's a helpful question. Well, now understanding what's going on. Well, when you go to work, are you just trading hours for time, for dollars? At some level, but what are you really trying to do? Well, you're trying to create value. Well, then ask the question, what kind of value are you trading for Valley Pike? Well, somebody runs a coffee shop. They need somebody who not only can, make coffee and show up on time, but also somebody who can connect and relate to the customers, because part of the value of this particular coffee shop is its connection locally, and who may be able to connect to them and then start to make associations. Oh, you know so-and-so, I know so-and-so, and those kinds of things. In other words, there's an understanding of what the bigger mission is. And so it's not just selling coffee. It's also about selling a place. It's about a place to be. It's a place to hang out. It's a place to interact with other people. Well, that subtly changes. It's not just the coffee I'm making. It's the experience that I'm doing when I deliver the coffee. So that may mean I make the coffee and then I joke around a little bit. That may mean that I remember people so they feel like they're local, so that when the drink comes in, say, hey, you ordered this, right? Those kinds of things. And then there's the do aspect of it, then to understand all those things and to act on those. Now, that example may seem a little silly, but think about the contrast between a kid who just shows up and says, tell me what to do, and then doesn't leave, versus the kid that shows up, asks questions so they fully understand what the real mission of the organization is, and then do their best to execute on that understanding. I can tell you from our experience sending our students to work there, there's a genuine, significant, and serious difference between those two things in terms of how all that works. And that's the power of understanding, that ability to go another level or two deep and understand what's going on.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that makes sense. But in case there's some listeners who might kind of have some doubts about this, just to play a little bit of devil's advocate, there might be a response that says, okay, yeah, but that going to all that extra effort to understand all that context and to put in that extra work, that doesn't actually necessarily get me more money. I'm putting in the same amount of time. I'm earning the same paycheck. What does that actually get me in that situation? How do I benefit from that?
Trent, you want to take this, or I can answer as well?
Yeah, so I'm definitely happy to, because I actually have a little bit of direct experience in this department.
I was thinking this might be kind of right up your alley. Trent didn't work for Valley Pike, but he does know what we're talking about because of similar experiences. Yeah, go for it, Trent.
Yeah, so when I was still in high school, I started working at a restaurant, and I started out in the dish pit at this restaurant. It was a pretty nice place. It was really close to where I lived. And I remember when I first started working there, I was kind of perplexed by the fact that as I showed up and was doing everything that Jonathan was talking about and trying to understand, okay, I'm not just here doing dishes. I'm doing dishes well so that we can provide good service up front. If there's a spot on dish or a spot on a spoon, this is a nice restaurant. That really lowers the value of the experience. That damages the server's ability to collect tips, overall lessens the reputation of the restaurant. So if I mess up just one piece of silverware here, that does actually a decent amount of damage to the business. So I need to be doing this well. So that was kind of my mindset in approaching this whole thing. And I was working through and figuring that was kind of normal, but I was surprised by the fact that a lot of the other kids who were my age who were working for a restaurant at the time, that was not the case. And because of that, after I had been there for like 2-3 months, I went from being somebody who was working part-time and kind of asking for more hours to be working pretty dang near to full-time at this place because they had just let everybody else go when I was getting all the shifts. And then eventually, later down the road, 2 years or so after working at this restaurant for a while, just because I had been a good employee, a opportunity opened up further and down the line at the restaurant that was a little bit higher up, a little bit better paying, and I got immediately moved into that slot as soon as it opened. And so it was one of those things where I may not have reaped returns immediately. I didn't day one show up and get a pay raise just because I was being a good employee and because I was caring about the overall business. But I did eventually reap some rewards that came from that because they recognized me as somebody who they could trust and who shared the vision that they were trying to bring to the customer experience in the first place.
I think that's an excellent example. I also think it's a great question, David, because I think that is a logical question to ask. This is how, I'm still getting paid the same amount of money. Mm-hmm. Trent's case is that you won't be getting paid the same amount of money for long. And I would back that up emphatically. The students we've seen work at Valley Pike, for example, don't stay in those positions for very long. They move up. They become, coffee shop managers and those kinds of things. And that does result in more pay. But there's a bigger payoff here that is worth paying attention to. When you start an entry-level job, is it just trying to fill your checking account? And the answer, of course, is, well, yeah, it is that, but it's something bigger, right? How many times, we have this all the time, people come to us and say, my kid's just graduating from college and they're applying for jobs and they're applying and they have a degree in IT stuff, and all the IT jobs, even for help desks say, 2 years experience needed. How can I have 2 years experience? I just graduated from college. And we'd say, well, you should have gone to Ascend because you would have been working in Ascend and you'd have that already. But the point is that when you're working that job, you are getting that experience. And you say, yes, but I want to work in IT, and you're talking about coffee shop stuff. Yeah, but there's some universals in jobs, right? And here's a sore point for us right now. We have our graduates in crazy demand at the moment, and people are asking us all the time, but they're saying things that I think are sort of almost incredible. They're saying, I just need people who come to work on time. I need people who can relate to customers, can relate to other coworkers. I need people who I don't have to supervise constantly. I need people who can bring value to the business. Well, where do you learn those things? Well, it doesn't matter what your long-term profession is. Let's say you would then come to work for Unbound. Unbound has almost nothing in common with working at a coffee shop. There's really no overlap there at all, except for you really can't work on Unbound unless we know for sure you're going to be able to show up, that you're going to be able to work when you're not supervised, that you're going to be able to see problems that we don't see and be able to fix them, that you're going to be able to have that kind of initiative, and then we can trust you explicitly. And that kind of thing is what you also learn by understanding, by having this extra level of pushing into it and going, what is going on here, and asking those questions. You start to get those answers. And as you build up those answers, it puts you in a place to ask a better question. I know what it takes to deliver value at a coffee shop. What does it take to deliver value at this next company? What does it take? And you're going to be coming from some experience. I know what my boss, I know that people that I work for like it if I can do blank. What is the specific way I can do that in this company? And there's a compounding effect there that can end up becoming powerful.
I think that's a helpful explanation, because starter level jobs, while they may be fairly menial tasks that from a practical standpoint don't actually really help you to advance very much, just being in a workplace and being able to understand the full context of what it means to provide value in your place of work is a really, really helpful way to be able to look at it and to see the difference that makes. We've been talking a lot about just workplace dynamics, which I think is a very easy, practical way to make these principles make sense. But I think that we all agree that these are principles that don't just apply to the workplace, that they apply elsewhere in other areas of life. What would be some examples, do you guys think, where that would apply, not just in the workplace, but in the context of other communities and places that you might be involved in?
I think we see it most in relationships, right? We see this a lot, and we talk to students a lot about this, that at some level, people think relationships are as natural as breathing, that, I know people, and so I have relationships. And then there's some level, and we get this a lot, well, I'm an extrovert, so I'm good at relationships, but I'm an introvert, but I'm not good at relationships. And that, of course, is a very shallow understanding of the whole situation. And what we would say is that if you understand how a relationship works, being good at relationships is a learned skill. It's something that you can get better at. And it's something that when you get better at, it transforms everything about your life. And it doesn't have to do with whether you're introverted or extroverted. It has to do with if you understand human beings, if you understand who they are, made in the image of God, if you understand that they're fallen, so they're going to sin and do stupid stuff, and you are too. If you understand what it takes to make a relationship work, and then if you understand why it's important that relationships work, all of those things work together. And if you understand that, what you will do changes dramatically based on what you understand.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of contrast of just kind of going back to talking about ask and the question spaces, that like you have to be able to, as we talked about there, once you get the answer to a question, take that into context and then use that to ask more and better questions. And it's a process of building upon itself, because you need to be able to actually see and fully take into account the answers that you're getting, especially when it does come to people, because there are some things that you'll learn universally and there are some things that are more individually applicable. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. And Trent, what about you? What are some other areas that you think you've seen the understand principle kind of played out for yourself?
Yeah. So for me, probably the way that it jumps out most is more so in kind of understanding culture. That just tends to be the place that occupies most of my mental space. And there is, in the same way that Jonathan was talking about relationships, you can understand the cultural moment and say, hey, I know these things are happening out there right now. I know that certain movements are on the rise, certain political movements are happening. I can see, our institutions in places like Hollywood are going pretty far awry. And it's one thing to understand that that's happening. It's another thing to understand, okay, why is that happening? And if you understand the why, then that also gives you a little bit more, to connect this all together, it gives you a little bit more of the how of how you actually go out and change those things and try to make a difference. So personally, that's where I'd see a lot of it. One other point that I did also kind of think of earlier that I would like to slip in here. One of the things that is interesting about this whole process of understanding is, and you touched on this a little bit in your answer, David, is that it's a cumulative practice where as you start trying to understand the small things, but trying to understand the small things in detail, that develops your ability to understand the more complex things in equal detail. So going back to the jobs analogy, working in a dish pit is really simple, and understanding why that relates to the customer experience eventually is a pretty easy connection. I am cleaning a dish. A customer is going to use that dish. That's an easy connection. Taking and making that same kind of connection with a business, if we're using Unbound as an example, that's a little bit more difficult, right? There's more layers that you're going through. There's more complexities. It's more interpersonal. And that same sort of thing happens with all these different processes. But the only way that I can learn how to understand Unbound in a bigger picture in my job here is if I first started by understanding something that was simple, like working in a dish pit, and then building from there. So it's one of those things where usually you start by understanding the really simple things, but if you make sure you understand those things in extreme detail, then the time a more complex thing comes around, you have a higher baseline of understanding to build off of in order to understand what that next thing actually looks like in its entirety.
Yeah. And I think it's worth noting that this is very much a mindset that you have to take on, that this is something that is not just going to immediately be obvious and is something that you're going to have to go out of your way to do, because it's not the expectation that the rest of the world is going to put on you that you do this. This is something that you have to build yourself. I remember when I was in grad school getting my postgraduate degree, I was really very unimpressed, frankly, by a lot of the classes that I was in, unfortunately, because, well, we talk a lot about our gripes with traditional education, and I was very much faced with a lot of those, with just some very cookie cutter teaching and examples, and just so much that was lacking when it came to actually talking about things that I thought were going to be relevant to me. And so it was very easy, and a lot of my classmates found this to be the case. It was very easy to check out and to just say, I'm just here to make sure that I fill out the attendance requirement and, listen for anything that might be on the quiz later. And I'm not actually going to get any real world value out of this, because whenever I graduate, I'm just going to go to a company that's going to put me through their training courses and is going to teach me everything I need to actually know to do the job anyway. And I can completely understand why they thought of it that way, but I was sitting there, and I think I'll partially give credit to the fact that I was trying to use this model. I'll also partially give credit to the fact I was like, I'm spending the money to be in this place and to talk to people who, if nothing else, have some interesting experience, so I might as well just ask some interesting questions. And so I just tried to take some of those more boring classes and just tried to find, okay, maybe this isn't an actually interesting class. What are some interesting questions that I can ask? How can I try to draw practical application out of this? And so I use that as an opportunity to be able to say, okay, hey, professor, maybe we're talking about this very abstract concept that's only applicable at the very, very highest echelon of, organizational leadership in billion-dollar companies. How does that look differently in more mid-sized companies that a lot of us will probably going to end up working at? And what does that look like? And that ended up, at least for me, maybe the rest of my classmates thought that me asking questions just made the class track on longer, but at least for me, it made it feel like I could gain more value out of the classes just by seeing that there was value to be gained if I went out and again asked questions. And once I was able to do that, then you can build more value out of that. So all of that example to say that it's a mindset that you can apply if you are looking for opportunities to do so. And it just takes a little bit of intentionality to look for those opportunities.
I think that mindset part is really important, David, because one of the things we want to be careful about saying here is that we're not saying understand means understanding these things. Now, I would argue that on a macro scale, I don't think that you can live effectively or live successfully without understanding some of those big questions we talked about earlier. Why were you here? Why are you here? What is your purpose? What happens to you when you die? And I would suggest that there are answers to that are truth with a capital T. But when we're talking about understand, we're not saying, hey, here's a list of 20 things. If you understand these, you'll do great in the world. Instead, we're talking about a mindset, and the mindset goes like this. It's important for me to ask questions. So this is an unending quest for curiosity, that I'm going to approach life knowing that there's always more that I don't know than what I do know. So how do I get to that? Well, I learn how to ask good questions so I can figure out what's going on. And I live in a world where what works is going to constantly get disrupted by technological change. So I'm going to have to constantly ask what's going on here, right? And then second, when I ask those questions, I'm asking because I want to seek to understand, which is this mindset that I want to go a little under the hood. Everybody, all of us here have some various experience with this, but everybody knows that you go out and turn the key and the car starts and you drive it until you go out and turn the key and the car does not start. And then it's a level of understanding. Why does it not start? And it might not start because you say, well, the battery's dead or something. But there might be some deeper, and there's deeper and deeper levels, right? I mean, well, it's not just the battery, it's the starter. Well, it's not just the starter, but it's the connection between the battery and the starter. Well, what does the starter do and what does the battery do and how does that relate to the engine, right? Every level of understanding allows you a different set of things that you can now do in that situation, ranging from I'm going to fix it myself to I'm going to call my friend who can fix this to I'm going to call a tow truck. And so there's an attitude of understanding that then informs the actions you can take. And all of this is just theoretical until you actually do something, which is what we talked in the last episode. So now if we run that all back, we're sitting in a situation where, we want to train young adults to go through life. And we're suggesting to those of you listening to this that you can be more effective at going through life. If you go through life with this attitude of curiosity, always asking questions and knowing when you get an answer, it just puts you in a place to ask a better question. Then when you ask those questions, you're seeking to understand what's going on beneath the surface. Why are these things working that way? Whether that's a car or whether that's a relationship. And then once you understand those things, apply it and see what happens. Because when you do that, there's a tautology here. When you do that, it's going to put you in a position to ask a better question, which will allow you to understand something more, which will allow you to do something different and more, which will put you in a position to, and our suggestion is that you're going to do that for the rest of your life. And then when it comes to understanding God, you're going to do that for the rest of eternity. And that's the kind of mindset we're pushing here. And people that have that mindset, just by definition, wind up living a fuller, richer, more effective life in almost any way you can measure that.
I think it's also another little caveat that's worth noting too, is that we're not necessarily advocating like understanding and knowledge just for the sake of puffing yourself up. And we're not necessarily saying that all knowledge is necessarily relevant to you, because like we talked about in the last episode, that the knowledge is really only useful once you actually use it. And there's some benefit to having context and to understanding more of the world around you and knowing things that might not necessarily be applicable for you yet. But there's still different levels to your example about the car. For me personally, I'm not very mechanically inclined, and so there's a certain level to which it's not really that useful for me necessarily to understand all of the inner mechanics of exactly how all of the different parts of my car work. I think it is useful to understand, have a general idea of how my car works so that I can do basic troubleshooting. And I think that there's a pretty decent argument to be made, in my opinion, that if you own a car, you should probably have some of that understanding at least. So if you do find yourself in the situation where you go out to the car and it doesn't start, then you can at least have some ability to diagnose it, or at least.
On the other hand, when my laptop doesn't start, I'm dead right there. Like if I flip the lid of my laptop and nothing happens, I understand one thing: the laptop didn't work, and I know that has one action that happens next. David, my laptop doesn't work, and then David will be able to take it from there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so ultimately, like all that is to say, like, I think that there are certain things that are really useful for us to understand, but just because you can understand something, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to the full extent of understanding it. That's not what we're saying. I think that we are just espousing the overall usefulness of understanding, especially the answers to those big questions and the context that it can give you.
Yeah, that's important, David. It's not that we're saying you should understand everything. If you don't understand how a car works, you're a dummy. We're not saying that. Or if you don't understand how a laptop works, you're a dummy. So we're an equal opportunity insulter here. It's having this attitude of what God has put in front of you to ask the questions to understand that. And if your interests don't lie to cars but go to laptops, that's fine. We're not saying that you should understand all things. That would also be impossible. We're saying that, but the things before you to press into it. So let's end with this, and I'm going to put Trent on the spot here, and I'm going to ask him a question, because there's a level of I think David mentioned knowledge for its own sake, or knowledge that puffs you up, or knowledge that is not necessarily immediately practical. Trent said earlier that his space is taken up a lot with understanding culture. His brain space, his time is taken up a lot with understanding culture. And those of us who know Trent know that that's quite a serious statement, that he does really deep reading and really deep processing. And if you ever heard Trent speak, he speaks on really deep issues. And so on one end of that looks very ethereal, or is very kind of, in terms of book learning or broad ideas. Yet, Trent, you had an interesting experience not long ago when you were in one of our major metropolitan areas in the country, and you were faced with somebody that was doing some pretty violent and erratic things. And from my understanding of the other people who were with you, your actions at that point defused and also kind of put in position things that kept everybody else in that situation safe, and did it in a way that had a good outcome to that. My take is that there's lots of reasons for that, but the primary reasons are because of these bigger ideas that you understood. I think it was an interesting example of your big understanding of culture and people and who they are that all of a sudden came down to a really sharp point of somebody acting really erratically in public transportation. Again, putting you on the spot a little bit here, but maybe tell that story, or at least to put the connection between the kind of theoretical stuff that you had and the practical application of that.
So the particular example they are referring to, a group of us were in New York City, and we got on the subway for about a 20 minutes subway ride, and an individual who was clearly not in their right mind space was clearly hopped up on some sort of drug, got on the subway and started making some noise. And effectively what happened is just I placed myself in a position where I was in between that individual and the rest of at least our individual group on the subway. Things didn't escalate too far, thankfully. He got a little bit more noisy and tried to push me around a little bit, but thankfully things suffused from there after he, expressed his displeasure with my existence. It ended up being fine. But one of the things that this is a conversation Jonathan and I actually had a little while back, while I was reflecting on that whole situation, is there were a lot of individuals on that subway who could have done something but elected not to, and more so just directly ignored the situation. And I found that to be kind of alarming, because it was one of those things where for me, it felt like this was instinct. I should do this because this is going wrong and I am in a place to fix it, and therefore naturally I should do it. And as we were kind of exploring, okay, why is that? One of the things that we're talking about, just from a, putting yourself physically in a dangerous spot, you make a decision whether you are going to do something like that ahead of time. You decide whether you're going to be the kind of individual who is going to intercede in a situation like that. That connects back to your broader value system. For me, the connection there is that I have certain perspectives about my individual capabilities. I'm a decently large individual, and so there are other individuals who are not as physically capable as I am. That lays on me some responsibility to use what God has given me to do certain things. And other people don't make that connection because they don't assume responsibility for anything that is outside of their immediate circle. They don't really see a broader connection back to, hey, God placed you on this earth to do some things, and therefore when certain opportunities arise, you should actually go out and fulfill them. In fact, actually, this guy a little bit in the weeds, but I was just thinking of a Winston Churchill quote. To each individual, there comes a certain time in their life when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and given the opportunity to do some special thing. And that thing is suited to their unique skills and talents. It is a shame whenever that thing finds them unprepared or unqualified for what could have been their finest hour. And so within the Christian worldview, we have this perspective that says that we were created for certain purposes. We have things that we are meant to accomplish, and therefore we prepare ourselves to do those things when God presents those opportunities for us. And to kind of tie this back to the whole understand thing, when you understand a perspective like that, when it comes down to the last moment of you actually have to take action, when you actually have to do things, it does move into that point of being instinctive because you have reasoned through all the possibilities and all the different potential actions that you could have taken, already select out the one that is going to fit most appropriately into your understanding of the world. And I think at a foundational level, when we talk about understanding is the thing that orients you, is the thing that tells you what to do next in any given situation, both big and small. And so when you're trying to understand more things, effectively what you're trying to do is understand more about what that next step is going to look like, and to some degree, prepare yourself for future situations as you start to encounter them more and more.
So we're going to summarize this and wrap this up, but I want to just go back and I want our listeners to hear, and I want to interpret a little bit. Trent said, Trent has asked the question, what is my responsibility? He's asked a lot of questions, but he's asked those questions. He understands in a context of both his Christianity and other things about what can take place here, and also the various factors happen. And then that resulted in immediate action that he didn't have to think about in this particular situation. I think Trent left a few things out, including some maybe bodily fluids that were spat at him and some other things at that time. And so here's the point. There's a couple of ways this goes really differently, right? One is Trent says, this is not my thing. I'm not getting involved. He hasn't asked the question about who's responsible. That could have led to an escalation or could have even led to somebody getting hurt. There's another aspect here. Trent glossed this over, but he has an individual who's berating him, screaming at him, spitting at him, and all these kinds of things. There's another aspect here. This question could be asked, this could be an understanding of my position and that I don't like to be made fun of in front of everybody. And so I'm going to bop this dude in the head, right? I'm going to take him down. I'm going to make him pay for the kinds of things he's doing. And there's an understanding here. It's like, no, this person's made in the image of God. That's not the right escalation in this situation. I can take this abuse because my identity is not in whether somebody calls me names in the subway. My identity is in something bigger. And so therefore, my role here is to make sure that the folks in this train are not hurt, but my role is not to prove something by escalating the situation with this individual. There's some serious nuance in that. And I use this example, and I thank you, Trent, for letting me put you on the spot there, because this is an example of something that you don't have time to think about at the moment. This isn't like somebody offers you a job or position change. You go home and think about it for 3 days to make a decision. This is a right there happening with the consequences possibly being dire. And it requires you to have asked good questions, to have understood the answers to those questions so that you're prepared for action. And as we finish this, that might be the big lesson we're trying to say here. We're pressing you to have the mindset that you ask good questions, that you look underneath and you understand the answers that you're getting, so that when the time comes to act, you're prepared to do so, and you can do so effectively, you can do so quickly, and you can do so in a position that puts you in a place you can ask a better question and keep moving forward. We would suggest to you that's a better way to live. We might also suggest to you it's a more exciting way to live as well.
I mean, if nothing else, it means that your adventures on the New York subway are interesting. I mean, the adventures on the New York subway are always interesting, but I think in this case, transactions helped us to be able to navigate that in a much more positive light when it could have been much more negative.
Well, I mean, the question maybe to ask is, why would you go to the New York subway without Trent? That might be a good question to ask, right?
I mean, the answer to that was we never did after that, so.
we finally got to a conclusion to our little story here. So for all of you out there, the real message of this is, don't go to the New York subway without Trent. Well, as always, fun conversation with Trent, some interesting perspective. And, you got not only stories of Trent working in a restaurant, but we got stories of Trent confronting bad guys in the subway. So, I mean, what more can you ask for one episode? So hope you enjoyed that. Also hope if you didn't get a chance that you get to listen to our special live episode. If you were on it live, thanks again for that. If not, we aired that as a special episode on the channel here, so you can go back and check that out. We obviously, at the end of these episodes, talk a little bit about what Unbound's doing, what's going on. And so when you listen to this, we are coming down to the last days of our Ascend enrollment, and we're getting into the last days for our equip enrollment for high school. Ascend is our post-high school program. If you're interested in those, please go to beunbound.us and check those out. We also want to make a special announcement, which was part of the reason we did the live podcast, which is that if you haven't heard us recently, we've done some webinars, we've done some speaking about this. We have a job guarantee that comes with the Ascend program. We guarantee our students will be employed when they graduate. We refund all the tuition, and we have all the details on our website. Well, what's happened is that we have a lot of empty jobs. Like we have a lot of people who want to hire students, and we don't have enough students to fill those positions. And so that's been a fairly rapid over the summer. We're just going to be flooded with all these jobs, and it looks like that's going to be a trend that continues for some time. And so with that in mind, we've really turned around and said we need to up the volume and the amount of people that we have in this program. And because of that, we've reconfigured some of the pricing for Ascend and some of the ways that we're presenting that, so it makes it easier to understand and also hopefully makes it easier for folks to enroll so that we can continue to serve some really great companies out there who want our talent. And we gave them all that we had, and it just wasn't enough. And so we'd like to keep working with these companies, but to do that, we have to be able to keep producing talent, and that means we need a little bit more in the front door. And so if that's interesting to you, even if you considered us before, perhaps if you kind of walked away and said, well, maybe not now, or the pricing was a little out of touch for you, go back because we just reworked that. The pricing is set right now that a young person could work part-time at an entry-level job. We talked about something like Valley Pike in our presentation here, or our podcast here today. And they could work part-time for a company like that, and they could pay for the program, which would then guarantee their employment at the other end. And not only that, but more and more, we have jobs that we can offer to students in the program because we have so many companies asking for fractional work and part-time work and those kinds of things. So there has been some changes there. If you're interested or still interested in us, now's a really great time to check that out. And if you want any more details, go back and check out that live episode that we aired as our special edition here recently.
Yeah, the jobs that we have that are companies that are coming to us, they are from all different sorts of backgrounds and industries and are for all sorts of students with different interest levels and experience levels. Anything from more accounting and bookkeeping work to some administrative positions all the way over to we have quite a few trades connections for students who are a little bit more interested in those and getting some hands-on experience in those fields. There's a lot, and we would absolutely be delighted to get some more students in there and build connections with some great companies and to be able to give some students some great jobs.
Yesterday, I got requests for 2 positions. I have a company, it's a phenomenal company to work for that needs a full-time bookkeeper, so that'd be the accounting type of stuff. And I have a company that's a construction company that's looking for a project manager, somebody who can both run the office and run the kind of estimates and projects and coordinate things in the field. And both of them specifically requested our graduates because I've worked with them in the past and I've found them to be absolutely fantastic. And so that's just 2 examples. They came in yesterday. I'm literally in a position that I get multiple phone calls, texts, and messages a day asking for student talent. And so if that's interesting to you, beunbound.us. Thanks again for taking your time. We hope this is an episode that's helpful for you, that you can seek to understand more so that your actions can be more effective as you go and we go through this framework. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, be unbound.